All right, welcome to the Majlis. This is our third virtual, and we hope it's our last. Normally, in normal times, we are all in Maglione Hall in a roundtable format where we can really take a deep dive into discussing these subjects. But this marks the end of our sixth season, and it's appropriate that tonight we have as our speaker Professor Nader Hashemi, who all the Majlis people know very well. Nader is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies, which is housed in the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies at the Korbel School. And his scholarship is focused most recently on sectarianism. But what's most important is that, as one of our participants has said, Nader has made us all better citizens. Through using his contacts, he has brought us top line speakers for 6 years, and he has led us through many discussions. And next year, he's going to be on sabbatical, which is why I wanted to introduce him tonight, so that we could thank him for his generosity and the time he has invested in us. So with that, Nader is going to speak about Biden's policy in the Middle East, but primarily, I believe, the current hot topic. Nader, go ahead, take it away.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight, Judith. Judith, thank you for those generous remarks. I'm sorry that we all can't meet in person, but as you all know, we're still in a pandemic crisis. But of course, the good news is that things are headed in a positive direction. So I'm hoping that perhaps at the next Majlis Roundtable, it can be done in person. It's a huge honor to have Tom Ferrer with us tonight. Tom is a university professor at the University of Denver. He, of course, is the former dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies, and his contributions to our school have been immense and enduring. And we are grateful for the leadership that he has shown us when he was dean and afterwards. He was dean from 1996 to 2010. And as I was telling Judith just before we began, a big reason why I came to the University of Denver was because of Tom Ferrer. When I was in the job market and I came for the interview, Tom made such a huge impression on me that I knew that this was the right place to start my career, and I have no regrets. And I'm very indebted to Tom for the support that he has shown me over the years. Tom Ferrer is a major scholar of human rights, of international law, of US foreign policy. He's also written extensively on the Middle East, thus making him a perfect interlocutor for tonight's program. He has a very distinguished resume, and he's the author of a very important new book on sort of the global sort of migration, refugee crisis, and the politics of liberalism that I strongly recommend, published by Cambridge University Press. So it's wonderful to have Tom joining us tonight for the program. The format is similar to previous Majlis events that we've had. I want to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Tom for some comments. We will have perhaps a short back and forth, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for questions and answers. The format for the Q&A session will be as follows. If you have a question, please post it in the chat box, and we will collect the questions and try to get to as many of them as possible during the question answer period. But we aim to sort of wrap things up at the top of the hour. Because we're on Zoom, there's a general understanding that if you stay on Zoom for more than an hour, you're going to lose people. So now let's transition to the topic. The advertised topic for tonight's event is Joe Biden's Middle East policy, a sort of a 100-day assessment. And when Judith and I were planning this event over a month ago, the Israel-Palestine conflict was not on my mind and not on the minds of most people. At most, in my initial preparation for tonight's event, I was planning on making perhaps a passing reference to US foreign policy under Joe Biden and the Israel-Palestine conflict. I wanted to focus on, the issues that were germane to this topic and that were in the news. The Iran nuclear negotiations, the pullout of US troops from Afghanistan, Joe Biden's sort of statements and policies towards Saudi Arabia, and of course, the ongoing war in Yemen. But as all of you know, over the last 10 days, the Israel-Palestine conflict has erupted in ways that none of us could predict. And so I want to focus my remarks exclusively on Israel-Palestine and Joe Biden's foreign policy. I think not doing so would be a disservice to most people who are joining us tonight. I think this is the topic that has been at the top of not only US headlines, but global headlines for the last roughly 10 days, and will likely remain this way in the coming days. As a framework for my talk, I want to draw upon a recent article that I read, and I strongly recommend in Foreign Policy magazine. It roughly overlaps with my own views on this topic. And the title of the article, published on May the 13th in Foreign Policy magazine, is called "Biden's Old Playbook Won't End Israeli-Palestinian Violence. Further conflict is inevitable unless Washington ends Israel's impunity and includes Palestinians in its global democracy agenda." And this is written by Zaha Hassan and Daniel Levy. I strongly recommend it. The authors begin by saying that the United States is not responsible for the new wave of violence, death, and destruction that is now engulfing Israel and the Palestinian territories it occupies and controls. I both agree and disagree with this observation. I disagree with it in the following sense. I think years of one-sided pro-Israel, really meaning pro-Likud policies, have brought us to this moment of crisis. Both the Republican and Democratic parties are guilty here. Israel has zero incentive to respect international law, withdraw from the occupied territories, or treat the Palestinians equally or humanely, given decade upon decade upon decade of unconditional bipartisan American support. Allow me to take you back briefly to the Obama administration and the question of Israel-Palestine. In contrast to Joe Biden, Barack Obama did spend some political capital and energy in attempting to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. In his first term, he appointed former U.S. Senator from the Democratic Party, George Mitchell, as his special U.S. envoy for Israel-Palestinian peace. Senator Mitchell made several trips to the region, met with Israeli leaders, met with Palestinian leaders, came back and updated the president. But despite those efforts, nothing happened. And nothing happened for the usual reasons. Israel, which is the much more powerful party here, which holds most of the cards, simply refused to budge. Benjamin Netanyahu refused to stop settlement activity and expansion in the West Bank. He even refused to consider a temporary freeze on settlement expansion or to seriously move toward or consider a two-state solution. Netanyahu very firmly and effectively told President Obama that he simply wasn't interested in a change in Israeli policy. To highlight a particular episode that sort of illustrates this particular moment, Joe Biden, then vice president, made a trip in the first term of the Biden administration, in the first term of the Obama administration, to Israel. And on the very same day that Joe Biden lands in Ben Gurion Airport, Benjamin Netanyahu chooses that particular day to announce a major settlement expansion. The timing of this announcement, I think, is significant. Doing this at this particular moment, the day that the vice president arrives in Israel, knowing that President Obama is pursuing a policy and a strategy for Israeli-Palestinian peace, is the sort of diplomatic equivalent of saying to the Obama administration, you can get lost. I don't care about your Israel-Palestine policy. I'm not going to consider it. And so it was a very bold and a very firm rebuke that Netanyahu gave to the Obama administration. In a follow-up visit, when Netanyahu then comes to the United States afterwards, President Obama sent him a very subtle and firm reply by keeping Benjamin Netanyahu waiting for roughly 45 minutes before the meeting began. And this, in diplomatic terms, in terms of diplomatic protocol, is sort of a rude thing to do. It's considered disrespectful, but it was, I think, in my reading, Obama's attempt to send a message to Netanyahu that he can be rude as well. In that meeting, in that visit in the White House, when Netanyahu was in Washington, D.C., the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States, exchanged views on a variety of topics of mutual concern, including Israel-Palestine. This was reported in the press, and of course, nothing came of it. But on that same day, after Netanyahu leaves the White House, he goes to the U.S. Congress, where Nancy Pelosi welcomes him with open arms and famously says, quote, "In the U.S. Congress, when it comes to Israel, we speak with one voice," end quote. Most members of the Congress during this visit welcomed Netanyahu with an enthusiastic reception of warmth and gratitude. If you actually go and listen to the speech, it's quite a spectacle. Netanyahu got at least 12 standing ovations. I stopped counting after 12, but this gives you a sense of, the bipartisan U.S. foreign policy approach to Israel. It's been unconditional. And what's interesting is that despite, Obama's sort of relationship with Netanyahu and disagreements, a lot of people don't know this, but President Obama was the most pro-Israel president in the history of the United States prior to Donald Trump, judged in terms of weapon sales, the number of UN resolutions that the United States vetoed in support of Israel, and the support that President Obama gave to Israel during 3 wars in Gaza in 2009, 2012, and 2014. So this U.S. coddling and unconditional support for Israel, I think the best analogy that I can come up with that has produced this particular crisis moment and produced what we're seeing right now is the classic problem of a spoiled child. Anyone who's raised a child or knows anything about child rearing knows that if you never discipline a child, if you never show some tough love, if you simply cater to every wish and whim that the child wants, give it effusive praise and never words of guidance, the results are predictable. The child grows up arrogant, the child grows up rude, the child starts to behave in ways that violates the values of the parents. And I think this is fundamentally what's happening today, and it contributes to the crisis that we're seeing. In terms of Biden's history with Israel-Palestine, he has an unblemished record of solid pro-Israel support. There's zero evidence to suggest that he has come anywhere close to a balanced position on the subject when he was vice president or when he was a member of Congress. Now, there's an important clarification here. There's nothing wrong with being pro-Israel, not at face value. But when we speak about pro-Israel positions, we effectively mean, in the context of American politics, rejecting the basic human rights and national rights for the Palestinians. That has been Joe Biden's record, and of course, he's not the only one in American politics who's taken that position. There's a famous line that summarizes Joe Biden's policy toward Israel-Palestine. In one particular meeting with Netanyahu, he famously said, quote, "Bibi, I disagree with everything that you have said, but I still love you," end quote. There's another sort of vignette that I think reflects Biden's policies toward Israel-Palestine. I would situate Biden basically the same as the Obama administration, but Biden, I think, is much more, pro-Israel than Obama was. Those people who follow this conflict might recall that at the end, in the last few days of the Obama administration, we're talking about December 2016, when Obama was on his way out, there was a UN Security Council resolution that was on the books that was critical of Israel. And for the first time, instead of vetoing that resolution, the Obama administration abstained on the resolution. And John Kerry gave a very famous speech that sort of suggested a departure from previous positions and was somewhat more balanced. Of course, this happened right after Christmas when no one was watching, so the political costs were very low, and supporters of Obama, really sang the praises of the Obama administration for sort of trying to be more balanced. But on that particular moment, later it was reported that Joe Biden opposed the abstaining at the UN by the United States on that resolution. He wanted the United States, in other words, to veto the resolution. It's a small point, but it suggests and underscores the point that I've already made about Joe Biden's political orientation toward Israel-Palestine. Coming into office, the Biden and Blinken foreign policy team really did not have a plan or an interest in pursuing anything related to Israel-Palestine. There was simply an assumption that the status quo would be maintained. Antony Blinken has also a long history of solid pro-Israel positions. The bigger challenge for Team Biden coming into office was trying to withdraw from the Middle East, trying to pull out troops, largely from Afghanistan, but also from other parts of the Middle East to focus on bigger challenges, primarily China, also Russia, questions of climate change, and fundamentally the internal crisis plaguing the United States. The crisis of the American middle class, the crisis that is tearing this country apart related to the rise of authoritarianism, the radicalization of the GOP, and the general realization in the Biden administration that time is not on the side of the Biden administration. History suggests that after a presidential election, in the first congressional election that takes place 2 years later, the party of the sitting president in the White House typically loses votes. And I think Joe Biden, to his credit, I really want to underscore this, Joe Biden, to his credit, has understood this, and he realizes that the strategy, the big foreign policy priority that demands his attention is he needs to deal with this existential crisis facing American democracy. It's been summarized as either go big or go home. And so Biden now has, as you all know, this Biden Build Back America plan. He sees himself as a new FDR. He wants to be transformational. He's pursuing these bold government policies to rescue the country. And we've seen those initiatives put forward, the COVID relief package, the infrastructure plan, the jobs plan, the clean energy plan. Investing in the Middle East, Biden had zero interest, nor was he interested in taking any risks, realizing that he didn't want to create any instability, and he wanted to focus particularly on the bigger challenges internationally and domestically. But of course, just after his 100 days in office, the Israel-Palestine conflict appeared, and it posed itself on this White House. And of course, Team Biden was caught by surprise. The general view that many people had in the US foreign policy establishment was that, look, this conflict is basically over. The Palestinians have been sort of deeply weakened. There was a general sense that not much could be done on the Israel-Palestine front, and we should all celebrate and sing the praises of the recent Israel-Arab state peace agreements known as the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration negotiated and that the Biden administration actually tried to own. Biden was very supportive of those agreements, like many other people in the mainstream American foreign policy establishment. Of course, those agreements were predicated on completely ignoring the Palestinian question. So Team Biden, in my view, should have seen this problem coming. This explosion of violence is the inevitable consequence of the permanent denial of basic Palestinian rights and freedoms by Israel, the matrix of discrimination and control that Israel imposes on every facet of Palestinian life, including the ongoing blockade of Gaza, now into its 15th year, making life there more untenable and intolerable. In response to recent events, the US government under President Joe Biden has adopted a depressingly familiar stance, meaningless calls for restraint from both sides, preventing any action at the UN Security Council that might be critical of Israel, and hiding behind the implausible notion that Washington has no leverage over one of its closest allies and largest aid recipients. In recent weeks, the events that actually triggered this round of violence were a series of aggressive Israeli measures toward Palestinians in East Jerusalem, around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, provocative policing tactics and green lighting of marches by Israeli extremists, and of course, the planned forced removal of Palestinian families from their homes in East Jerusalem. This also coincided with growing internal Palestinian anger at the indefinite postponement by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas of elections that have been planned for a very long time, but were delayed once again. 15 years, these elections have been delayed for 15 years. An administration that appeared determined to deprioritize the Middle East and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in particular, now faces the prospect of engaging with a prolonged conflagration. The experienced set of diplomats assembled in Biden's national security team should have known better. After all, they are a very experienced, seasoned, educated group of people, very well-read, most of them who served in the Obama administration and who presided over 3 almost identical conflicts. In other words, what we're seeing right now is effectively a replay of what happened in 2009 when the Obama administration was coming in. There was a war then known as Operation Cast Lead, called by Israel. Roughly 3 years later, in 2012, there was another upsurge in violence, again almost identical, known as Operation Pillar of Defense. And then in 2014, a repeat, an event known as Operation Protective Edge. Very similar circumstances. There's some trigger event. There's rockets that start flying from Gaza into Israel. There's an Israeli retaliation that is disproportionate. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of people killed, mostly Palestinian, mostly civilians. So while Israelis and Palestinians are the primary actors in this current drama, the United States is indisputably the most consequential actor in this arena. If Washington continues to get this file wrong, the consequences of Israel's denial of Palestinian rights are guaranteed to impose themselves on a U.S. foreign policy agenda that prefers to focus its interests and its energy elsewhere. There are at least 2 additional dangers that I think flow from this crisis that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. The first is the domestic. As you all have seen, if you're following this issue closely, a part of the Democratic Party and a part of the Democratic Congressional Caucus now is insisting on applying universal standards of human rights and international law to the treatment of Palestinians in unprecedented ways. This sits uneasily with the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party, which has historically carved out exemptions for Israel, holding it to a lower standard and endorsing the narratives of the Israeli and American right. The human rights community, including Palestinians, Israelis, and global human rights groups, are documenting Israeli practices. They've increasingly argued that what Israel now is doing constitutes the crime of apartheid. This is happening at the precise moment when Democrats are increasingly rallying around the banner of racial justice here in the United States. That will make the notion that justice is desirable, except for the Palestinians, much harder to sustain. This rhetorical acrobatic act would also be hard to pull off in the international arena. The America is back message has been all about, at least rhetorically speaking, adhering to the rule of law, upholding international norms, respecting the rights of other nations, supporting democracies on a global level. U.S. foreign policy has always been good at managing inconsistency and also hypocrisy, but being so out on a limb and so far from these professed commitments and values when it comes to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians exposes the United States government to vulnerabilities that can easily be exploited by others. And it's not hard to imagine Beijing, the Communist Party in China, saying the following: "You say Uyghurs, we say Palestinians." In other words, Uyghurs, the persecuted Muslim group in Xinjiang province that are facing gross crimes against humanity. And China is going to exploit this. And if you're following what's happening at the UN Security Council, for roughly the last week, there's been at least 3 attempts by the UN Security Council to issue a mere statement calling for a ceasefire and end to the violence. And the United States has blocked the issuing of that statement. And China has taken full advantage of this. They are openly mocking the United States. They're using this moment to shield themselves from criticism. And they're basically saying, look, don't criticize us for our human rights violations, and look what you're doing to the Palestinians. And so one of the takeaways from this, I think, event and from this very one-sided pro-Likud policy that we're seeing from the Biden administration, where the Biden administration is effectively acting as Israel's lawyer on the international stage, is that the Biden administration has given dictators and despots around the world a huge gift, particularly those dictators and despots that the US is in confrontation with. Xi Jinping in China, Vladimir Putin, Iran's supreme leader, Bashar al-Assad, and the leaders of other repressive regimes who will use this moment to mock US commitment to human rights and to upholding international law. So all of this talk about a rules-based order, about a new American commitment to a human rights foreign policy, about a new American commitment after the Trump administration, this new era rooted in multilateralism and human rights, all of this is open to question and open to ridicule. And it raises the question, why? Why is the Biden administration, why is Tony Blinken so willing to risk their reputation, their credibility over this particular topic? That's something we can talk about during the Q&A. I think a rights-based approach to U.S. foreign policy in the region would be much more consistent with Joe Biden's overall foreign policy agenda, and it would require less U.S. investment, not more. It could reverse the current negative trend lines and establish a new scaffolding on which future peace efforts could be built. To achieve this, I think simply reversing the egregious one-sided policies of Donald Trump toward the Middle East will not be enough. The status quo ante embraced by the previous Democratic administrations also consisted of an upside-down incentive structure that worked against peace, in particular by guaranteeing Israeli impunity, thereby encouraging the most extreme tendencies in Israeli politics and entailing a heavy investment of U.S. diplomatic effort and capital. This is not the time for Washington, D.C. to adopt a new blueprint for a solution, nor to refocus efforts on sustaining a peace process that has long since suffered from the law of diminishing returns and failed to deliver in any meaningful sense, room for negotiations or room for territorial compromise. U.S. policy has been good at making sure the Israelis get the security that they deserve. U.S. policy has been spectacularly bad at applying those standards to Palestinians and challenging the separate and unequal status that they suffer from. Things are guaranteed to get worse if Washington continues down this path, even if the diplomatic destructiveness of previous administrations is replaced by the apparent good intentions of its successor. The way to reverse this is to focus on human rights, dignity, and the right for all peoples in the Middle East, Israelis and Palestinians, to live in freedom and equality. I think the distorting impact of U.S. policies has been particularly pronounced when it comes to internal Israeli politics and public opinion. Washington's indulgence of Israeli practices that contravene both U.S. policy and international law have contributed to the marginalization of pro-peace voices and empowered those within Israel that now have a mentality that we can get away with anything and that will be zero consequences. U.S. policies, especially but not only under Donald Trump, helped nudge Israeli maximalism to the precipice of a de jure annexation of Palestinian territories, while significantly advancing a de facto annexation of those territories. Worse still, it enabled a sense among Israelis that the denial of Palestinian freedoms is manageable at a low cost, encouraging a nonchalance and a hubris that has been upended in recent days due to this conflict. A U.S. focus on ending the Gaza blockade and preventing land seizures, home demolitions and evictions, and the mass imprisonment, including of children, and also of settler violence and restrictions on Palestinian life, is in America's bilateral interests. And it's also, I would argue, in the long-term interests of Israel. I think these are the antidote This is the antidote to the current US policy. Meanwhile, Palestinians must, of course, lead to renewing their own politics. However, US and Israeli preference for an accountable Palestinian leadership committed to a peace process, has to be sort of, I think, invested in. Right now, if you look at what the Biden administration has done with respect to the Palestinian elections. The Palestinians were supposed to have elections when the Palestinian president announced that those elections would not take place because polls suggested that he would lose those elections. The Biden administration basically acquiesced. There was no pressure. There was no commitment. There was no sense that, look, you have to have an accountable government if you want U.S. support. And in fact, what we saw as the United States did to the Palestinians, what it has always done in the region, support regional dictators and authoritarian regimes, not upholding the professed values of democracy and human rights that the U.S. lays claim to. So I think a U.S. policy that remains on autopilot is bound to fail. Although Washington did not initiate this new round of violence that we're seeing, it is perpetually putting its thumb down on the scale of further injustice and conflict due to the reasons that I've just outlined. The current conflict may be simply a blip and end as abruptly as it began, but absence a change in U.S. foreign policy, renewed conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is inevitable, and with each iteration, the terms of engagement will deteriorate further, and the United States will be left carrying an even heavier Middle East burden as it seeks to focus its energies elsewhere. Let me just quickly end here with an observation about what I think is changing before our eyes. And what we're seeing right now in the United States is an important change on the Israel-Palestine conflict that's not taking place at the level of the Congress, a little bit at the Congress, not really taking place at the level of the state, but really is taking place at the level of society. For those of us who've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict for a very long time, we can clearly see this change taking place. And it's a change in terms of public perception. It's a change at the societal level, at the intellectual level, at the civil society level. There's a major shift, I think, happening in the United States, and it's directly connected to several developments. One, I think, the younger generation of American students and kids that are alive today are very sensitized, at least those that are politically active. They're very sensitized to the Black Lives Matters movement, to the question of historical racial injustice, to opposing voter suppression, very sensitive to the question of indigenous rights and what has happened to the indigenous population. These are the issues that animate young people. And of course, when they apply these positions, these principles to the Israel-Palestine conflict, they're going to be very critical of the status quo, and they're going to be very upset at the denial of the basic human rights that Palestinians are facing and that the United States is supporting by virtue of its one-sided policy. So I think that's an important, transformation that's happening. You're also seeing major shifts within the American Jewish community, particularly among younger American Jews, who are very upset at what Netanyahu is doing in their name. I think the Trump administration's strong embrace of Israel and of Netanyahu, ironically, has really pushed this process forward. If you didn't like Donald Trump, you didn't like what he was doing domestically or in terms of his foreign policy. And of course, one of Donald Trump's biggest allies and supporters and causes was his support for Benjamin Netanyahu. Lastly, I would point out that there has been an important transformation in terms of how human rights organizations are now looking at this conflict. Before, the standard human rights approach was that you had the state of Israel, and then you had the occupied territories, and international law and human rights law demanded that Israel withdraw from those occupied territories, and you would get something like a two-state solution. Now, the framework of analysis, it's a new shift, it's an early shift, but I predict this is going to be the new framework, is that now the issue is no longer Israel's control over the occupied territories, but now the new framework of analysis is the question of apartheid and the crime of apartheid that Israel is going to be charged with, or in fact has been charged with. So last week, the biggest human rights organization in the world, Human Rights Watch, issued a 213-page detailed report that effectively says a threshold has been crossed, and Israel is guilty now of the crime of apartheid. This echoed an earlier report in January of this year, where the leading human rights organization in Israel, B'Tselem, issued virtually an identical report that made the same argument. I suspect within a couple of months, Amnesty International is going to come forward with a similar report. And it's going to be very difficult to push back against this new analytical framework. And we can see these changes taking place, I think, for the first time in the Democratic Party. For the first time, you're seeing these dissident members coming out on the congressional floor and challenging Israel in ways that we haven't seen before. Even people who are very pro-Israel, like Senator Menendez, even Chuck Schumer was forced to sign on to a statement, supporting a ceasefire and being somewhat critical of the Biden administration. So I think this is the way the wind is blowing. It's a societal change. Whether it will affect American policy remains to be seen. I think it will probably take a generation for this to happen, but I think this is definitely the direction in terms of how things are unfolding, and we'll have to wait and see whether this plays itself out in this direction or not. So thank you very much. I've spoken longer than I've wanted to. Tom Farrer, the floor is yours.
Well, if I speak at any length, we won't have any time for questions and discussion. So I've been sitting here thinking, what can I say in 5 or 6 minutes, which might contribute to what you already said, Nader. Since this is an identity-obsessed moment historically, I suppose I should begin by saying that I'm a Jew. Now, that doesn't predict my policies, but at least it suggests why I'm keenly interested in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I have long seen it in a sort of bifocal way. One of the reasons being that one of my roommates at Princeton was Edward Said, the great Palestinian intellectual, happened to be Palestinian in his ethnic origins, although I always said he was actually much more an upper middle class American than I was, a provincial from New Hampshire. One of the really difficult questions is deciding how to characterize the conflict and how to characterize Israeli policy. What's the best analogy? Nader, you spoke of apartheid, and of course, Human Rights Watch's report says that Israel's policy can now be described as apartheid. Of course, no two historical circumstances, no two historical processes are identical. We're looking for analogies. And there's another analogy that's possible, and that I think is maybe even more relevant. I chaired a symposium on the conflict quite a few years ago when I was dean. And at the end of the formal session, an Israeli student who was studying at Korbel at the time came up to me and he said, look, why are you condemning our efforts to, I don't remember his exact language, but in effect, what he said was our efforts to achieve our manifest destiny. Your manifest destiny, you Americans, was to take over the continent. And in the process, you pushed the Native Americans out of the way. And isn't that our policy? It is our policy. And that's the, well, you didn't say this, but I was thinking that probably is the proper analogy. That what the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza presently have are really reservations, similar to the reservations that we established for Native Americans in the 19th century and preserved into the 20th century. I think that's a fair analogy. Now, of course, it's more complicated because, as I said, no analogy is perfect. It's more complicated because there are a large number of Palestinian ethnics living inside the 1967 boundaries of Israel as citizens, although there are members of the Knesset who have talked about removing their citizenship. But because there are a very considerable number of Palestinian ethnics living in Israel as citizens and enjoying some of the benefits of living in a very highly developed, rich, highly educated country, we don't have a pure analogy to our Native American policies or to apartheid, because in the case of apartheid, no Africans were allowed to have any of the rights that the English and Afrikaners enjoyed in South Africa. I recognize that. You've referred frequently to international law, and of course, one of the problems is that there are a significant number of people who doubt the existence of international law, think of international law as a series of convenient arrangements that vary from time to time, depending upon the interests of the great powers. If you asked me what I would advise Biden to do, because I think ultimately that's a question we need to address. If we're going to criticize Biden, we have to have some sense of what we would advise him to do if we were a part of his staff and able to influence him. And what I would advise him to do, though it involves some political risks, is simply to speak frankly and at length in one major public statement about the conflict. Most people, I think, have a very, very limited idea of the origins of the conflict. And the only person who's really in a position in the shorter term to shift perceptions of the conflict because without a shift in perceptions, you can't get, and this you yourself said, without a shift in perceptions, without a shift in governing narratives, you're not going to get a shift in American policy. The last thing I'll say is this. Perhaps I should say that I devoted a long chapter of my penultimate book on the conflict, and if anyone is interested in knowing what I think in the round, they merely have to turn to the book Confronting Global Terrorism and American Neoconservatism. But the last thing I'll say has to do with negotiations. It seems to me, almost as a matter of principle and theory, impossible to have successful negotiations between deeply unequal partners to the negotiation. We talk about the security of Israel. Israel is the most powerful country in the Middle East. Israel is probably one of the 10 most powerful countries in the world. Yes, it has a small population, but we know now that it's firepower that counts, it's efficiency, it's high tech that counts. It's not the size of your population. Israeli security is not at risk, except perhaps from an internal collapse of morale. And given the strength of nationalist feeling in Israel, I don't see that happening. So I think if I were going to advise Biden at how to reconcile these interests, it would be in terms of speaking frankly and at length about the origins of the conflict, and then speaking to how the conflict could be fairly resolved in terms of American concepts of fairness. But I left off my concluding remark about negotiations. I jumped really from one issue to the other. Back to negotiations. To have fruitful negotiations, you have to have parties of relatively equal power. Because if the two parties are deeply unequal in power, why should the party that is more powerful concede anything to the party that is less powerful? It would be irrational, it seems to me. Now, given the power of Israel as a state, as a society, there is no comparison at all between the power of the Palestinians and the power of the Israelis. It's a totally asymmetrical relationship in terms of power. So the only way in which fruitful negotiations could occur, that is, negotiations leading to compromise and ultimate settlement, is for a third party to put their finger on the scale on behalf of the weaker, in this case, the pathetically weak party, in order to establish some equilibrium between the negotiating parties. But the third party, in this case, the only relevant third party, that may be an overstatement because the Europeans could be a significant third party, but they have chosen for complex reasons not to be. So the US is the only possible third party that could put its finger on the scales, and it has put its finger on the scale of the more powerful party. Therefore, productive negotiations cannot occur. The only thing that can happen is capitulation by the Palestinians, and that was really what Trump was saying, or Jared was saying. You've lost, you have no hope. You once had some support, at least notional support from Arab countries, but now you don't. So give up, take what we give you, and let's move on. That was what they were saying. There was a certain honesty to that. It was loathsome. It violated my sense of fairness, but it was frank. So let me stop there and let's leave a little time for others.
Great. Yeah, Tom, great observations. There's so much I would love to comment on, but given the time restrictions and given the format, we're going to have to leave it to another time, but I'm in broad agreement with your observations. They're very insightful. But let's try and get to some questions and answers. I'll try to keep the answers, and Tom, please try and keep the answers as short as possible so we can get to as many questions as we can. Anna, do you want to just read out maybe the first question, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the remaining time?
Sure. Let's see. Judith asked to comment on Arab countries abandoning the Palestinians, if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. The question of Palestine has always been a core identity issue for Arabs and Muslims. And Arab countries have rhetorically sort of rallied, at least publicly and rhetorically, to the defense of the Palestinians. But what's happened in recent years is that most of these Arab countries, all of these Arab countries, with the exclusion of, I would say, Tunisia, are corrupt authoritarian regimes. They don't respect the human rights of their own citizens. They're not going to defend the human rights of, Palestinian citizens. And their fundamental existential crisis is their internal crisis of legitimacy. And so they've struck these deals. I mean, this is what the Abraham Accords were very, very much about. They've struck these diplomatic and national security deals with Israel as a way of providing external guarantees to the existing regimes, knowing that with the United States pivoting out of the Middle East, that they need a more reliable ally that's going to come to their defense, and that is Israel. The other element of the Palestinian question that affects the Arab regimes is that they view Palestinian suffering as a deeply destabilizing element in terms of their own politics. In other words, Palestinian suffering mobilizes their own citizens, gets them angry, and their citizens are angry at the regional status quo, and they're angry at the regimes in the Arab world that maintain the status quo. So Arab regimes want citizens to be politically apathetic, not to be politically mobilized. And so in that sense, Palestinian suffering is to be opposed by these Arab regimes because it has internal consequences for them. And so that's why these regimes have basically abandoned the Palestinians. The Emirates have been the leading countries, other regimes. They've also, so that's fundamentally what's going on. I could say a lot more, but I think that broadly explains why these corrupt authoritarian regimes have effectively abandoned the Palestinians. Next question.
Sure. We have one. Is a two-state solution beyond realistic at this point?
Tom, do you want to take that?
Yes, I think it is. Actually, there would be advantages to having Israel formally annex, ideally, all of the territory that it conquered in this 1967 war, including Gaza, which it doesn't really want, because then it would be impossible to continue to argue that there are many important issues which need to be resolved through negotiation when negotiation actually occurs. If Israel annexed all of these territories, then there would obviously be a single country. And then the only issue would be how the government of that country treats its citizens or treats its nationals, the people who are resident in the territory. And then the issue would be one of human rights. It's be a complicated issue, but it would provide the appropriate focus. At the present time, it's one of the foci for looking at it. If Israel annexed all of the territory, it would be, I think, the only focus for looking at it, and that would be the appropriate focus.
I would just add, I think that's one reason why Israel does not want to annex these territories, because then it would be responsible for the populations. So
exactly.
So it wants to have its cake and eat it too. But this is a longer debate whether a two-state solution is past us. That's the momentum. That's the dominant view among many people who study this topic, is that ship has sailed. There's too many Israeli settlements in the West Bank, too difficult to roll them back. You effectively have one authority governing roughly equal numbers of Arabs and Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and that's Israel. So it's an open question, but I think certainly the momentum is in the direction that Tom has suggested. Let's go to the third question.
What is the likelihood of an Israeli change in leadership following the surge in violence, taking into account the recent volatility of Israeli elections?
Tom, do you want to take that?
It may change, but it will have no effect on the issues that we're discussing, because the alternatives to Netanyahu share his basic views about the Palestinians. So there has to be a shift in the dominant narrative within Israel, and personnel really don't matter. Netanyahu has been unusually adept, I think, in terms of achieving the maximalist goals of Israeli conservatives. I would say the maximalist goals of the Zionist national movement, which began as one of the many nationalist movements in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, except it was the one nationalist movement that didn't have a territorial base. The Italians had one, the Germans had one, and so on. So the Zionist movement had to look for one. The natural place, of course, was Palestine. I could say much more, but let me stop right there.
Yeah, let's go to the next question.
Sure. We had a question about what the role would be of another country like Canada or other international entities in this conflict.
Well, since I come from Canada and I've followed Canadian politics somewhat closely, let me just offer a few comments. Canada really doesn't have a Middle East foreign policy. It has a domestic foreign policy with respect to the Middle East. What I mean by that, if you look at how Canadian governments adopt their Middle East policy, they look at what the domestic political debate is and which political constituencies within Canada are willing to support which political party, and that fundamentally shapes their foreign policy orientation. And so the strength of the pro-Israel, the right-wing pro-Israel lobby or movement in Canada is quite strong. And we saw this radical shift when Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister, was in power for about 8 years, where he took positions that were actually, to the right in many ways of Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, I stopped reading what the Canadian foreign policy position was on the Middle East. I just had to, go to the Israeli foreign policy website and see it. And that's what was, happening. The other element of Canadian foreign policy is that Canada knows it's not a major power. At best, it is a middle power, and it doesn't believe that it can independently do anything by itself. It has to work in concert with other countries. It has to engage in multilateralism, and its closest ally, its most important trading partner, is the United States. So it will never adopt a foreign policy position that will challenge U.S. foreign policy. There's no interest in Canada making those types of daring moves. I would like to think that, that's not the only option available. I think Canada's reputation internationally, particularly in the era of Donald Trump, is quite respected, especially when it comes to international law, human rights. I think Canada could be doing more, or should be doing more, but that would require a major shift internally. And there's a broad consensus in the Canadian foreign policy establishment among the two leading parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, that the current Canadian foreign policy orientation is the best one. We simply have to live with it and try and make the best of it. So if anyone is hoping that Canada is going to make a bold move here and act as a peacemaker in pushing forward a resolution of this conflict, don't hold your breath. Let's go to the next question. Tom, do you want to offer anything on Canada, since your wife is Canadian?
Yeah. No, I think you summed it up extremely well, Nader.
Okay, let's go to the next question. We're getting to the top of the hour. Maybe we'll take a couple more and then try to wrap it up.
All right, we have one about, if the U.S. withholds arms support to Israel, will it make negotiations more equal and fair?
Tom, you want to take that?
Arms support, or withholding arms support, is totally inadequate in terms of bringing pressure to bear on Israel. Israel is a wealthy country. It's far wealthier, certainly in terms of per capita income, than at least half of the members of the European Union, which makes it somewhat ironic that we're giving them $3.5 billion roughly in aid every year. Portugal needs it more. But we have many other and more important levers of power than arms. Israel can buy whatever arms it wants. Moreover, Israel even produces arms that are in demand by many other countries, because it has a very, very sophisticated high technology sector.
No, I would agree with that. It's not as easy as, if you just turn this lever, then Israel will capitulate. It would take something, a much greater set of conversations, discussions, some sort of developing consensus among, at least the Democratic Party, in terms of applying certain consequences for Israel. It's not a question of just cutting off the arms. It would have to, be a long-term series of policies that would start to send a message that Israel will not benefit from unconditional American support if it continues down this path. So it's more than simply, cutting off arms, which I don't think will ever be seriously considered. But I think these conversations that are happening in Congress, are conversations that are in the right direction. But it would take, I think, a much firmer commitment from a future American president and from senior members of the U.S. Congress to sort of send a message to Israel that it can't be business as usual.
Can I just add a word to that? I think there has to be a vision of the outcome, which we've never articulated beyond the notion of a two-state solution. The Israelis have, of course, reason to fear what the Palestinians would do if they had the power to do it, because from the Palestinian point of view, the Israelis are an invading force who took away their country, and they want their country back. Now, survey data indicates that the average Palestinian, I don't know about at this moment in time, but over the past 20 years, survey data showed that Palestinians have much more moderate views, much greater willingness to compromise than their leadership would suggest. But I think we can't expect the present or prospective leadership of the Palestinians or the present or prospective leadership of the Israelis to propose a solution which would do the maximum amount of justice to the two parties. So third parties, others, must suggest ways. Now, just in my next to last book, when I confronted this question, I looked at the year 1967, which is when the Israelis conquered the West Bank and Gaza. And I said one option that was open to the Israelis at the time was to forget the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership and say to local leaders in the occupied territory that we'll let you organize yourselves, govern yourselves. Not, you won't have a foreign policy, you won't be a state, but we will treat you as international law requires a country to treat occupied territory. The Israelis didn't agree that they should be described as occupied territories, but assuming they are, international law says that the occupying power must allow normal life to go on, normal civilian life to go on during the occupation. Because I think that if that had happened, a local leadership independent of Arafat and other maximalists would have evolved. And I see this as the way forward. I could elaborate on that, but I'll just stick to the basic premise that you can't just apply pressure to Israel. You have to suggest what would be an outcome which doesn't threaten the survival of Israel. And there are people with ideas about that. I even have a few ideas myself. But without that, just applying pressure without suggesting really what you want to achieve through that pressure, well, that's incoherent.
Great point. Let's take maybe one more question and I'll turn it back to Judith for concluding remarks.
I'm not actually seeing a ton more questions in the chat, but if you wanted to make any sort of closing remarks before we sign off.
Okay, I'll just pick up on one point that Tom has addressed here. I think part of a new U.S. foreign policy toward Israel-Palestine will require a future president to mobilize an American constituency for peace that can get behind such a shift in American policy. That would require, mobilizing groups in the United States who are willing to defend the new position. It would be, civil society groups, activist groups. It would include, sections of the American Jewish community. It would include African Americans, Muslim Americans. I think that would require, that's what's needed. I think, it would require investment, political capital, making a series of speeches that Tom has mentioned that outlines a vision for a future resolution of this conflict that draws upon American principles of justice. You sort of saw that a little bit when President Obama gave a series of speeches during the Arab Spring. In fact, there was one very memorable speech on May the 19th, 2011. I'll never forget it because I was in Kuwait at the time and I was watching the speech. And basically, it was a wonderful speech that was written where President Obama articulated a narrative on the Arab Spring, supporting the political changes, supporting democratization, but drawing upon the history of the struggle for racial justice and for the expansion of democracy here in the United States. It was pitch perfect, if you ask me. It's worth looking at speeches along those lines that broadly Americans who might not know the intricacies in the background and the history of this conflict, I think would have a broad appeal and would be very difficult to push back against. So I think that's got to be part of the solution. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Tom if he has any concluding remarks, and then we'll give it back to Judith.
No, I think I've said what I can usefully say within the time that we have, Nader, and
Great.
Thanks for including me in the program. I always enjoy listening to you.
And likewise, Tom, thank you for your contributions. They're always insightful and educational. So thank you for being with us tonight. And Judith, back to you.
Okay, I'll unmute myself for a change. Thank you, Dr. Fair, for joining us. It was wonderful to have you. I wish we'd had you earlier and more often. And Nader, of course, thank you very, very much. When we started this, we said we wanted to be able to look more closely at issues and hear an in-depth analysis that you just don't get. And you both gave us that tonight, and we're greatly appreciative of it. And have a wonderful sabbatical year. We'll miss you very much. Thank you.